So good afternoon, welcome to everyone on behalf of the Cathedral and the Diocese, the Diocesan Director of Readers, who's with me on the screen, to this Bible Talk lecture series for the autumn, focusing on John's Gospel. I'm going to hand over in a moment to Liz Shercliffe, who will introduce Bishop Julie, who's our guest speaker today. But before I do so, a few words from John's Gospel. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So over to you, Liz.
Thank you. So Bishop Julie, this is the first time you've done one of these talks, so you're particularly welcome with us. Bishop Julie grew up in the Northwest and has spent most of her life in exile somewhere down south. In the wrong part of the country, but you've got extensive experience of working with homeless people and in youth work and youth justice before and during ordination, which will give you a particular perspective on our topic for today. So we look forward to what you've got to say to us, Julie. Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to be with you. I wanted to start off. Liz is going to read us the text that I'm actually going to begin talking about. Partly, I want to root us in it because I'm going to deviate, but I think it's really important to start with the text. And the text I was given was John 21. She's going to read most of it, stopping just before the end bit.
Okay. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We'll go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat and you'll find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they'd gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you've just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they'd finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me."
Thanks, Liz. I really love the 21st chapter of John. I think I've preached on it about 3 times in the last year. What I love in particular is how Jesus responds to his confused and often clueless followers. And I can really relate to that. In particular, how he responds to Peter, who had let him down so badly, just as Jesus had foretold. So let me just recap in my own words. The scene that we've just had read for us by Liz is set after the resurrection. The disciples had gone back to their nets. Their world had fallen apart. Their Messiah had been crucified. Many of their hopes had been crushed. Despite resurrection appearances by Jesus, they really did not know what to make of it all. So they went back to fishing. And ironically, they couldn't even get that right. A lake teeming with fish, but they caught nothing. I have days like that too. Peter, I imagine, was in a particularly bad state. It was Peter who had suggested the fishing. I am going fishing, he'd said. And I don't think he just meant for leisure purposes or to catch breakfast. It had been his living before he met Jesus. He was going back to his old life because he didn't know what else to do. Then Jesus turned up. And as soon as Peter was told by James that it was Jesus, because Peter was a bit slow on the uptake and too preoccupied to notice, Peter leapt into the water, swam the last 100 yards, and met with Jesus on the shore. And now we get to the bit that I particularly like, that interaction between Peter and Jesus. After breakfast, sitting round the fire, Jesus asked Peter if he loved him. On first reading of the passage, you might find it strange because Jesus essentially asked the same question of Peter 3 times. You could be forgiven for thinking that Peter wasn't giving Jesus the right answer, the answer he wanted. So Jesus just kept on repeating it, rather like you do with a child who won't say please. Let me read you again, verses 15 to 17, because they really are my key texts as the jumping off point today. When they'd finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." Why did Jesus behave in this strange way? Well, I think it was to do with Peter's denial of Jesus just before the crucifixion. In chapter 18 of John, there's the account of Peter in the high priest's courtyard, another occasion when folk were gathered around a fire and where Peter was asked by 3 different people if he was a follower of Jesus. And each time, Peter vehemently denied this, just as Jesus had predicted he would. And now, here by the fire again, on the shore, this time, Jesus is giving Peter 3 opportunities to declare his love for him. A 3-fold question leading to a 3-fold affirmation of love, which corresponds to the 3-fold denial. The whole purpose of this conversation between Jesus and Peter is to allow Peter the opportunity to affirm his love for Jesus. It's a grace-filled moment. And it also shows the trust that Jesus placed in Peter, for he goes on to give him his commission to feed the sheep. Peter is appointed shepherd of the flock, leader of the early Christian community. I wonder, what do you think Jesus meant when he commanded Peter to feed his sheep? We usually think of sheep feeding in two ways. I don't mean literally sheep feeding. I'm thinking about this metaphor here. First, the idea of church leaders being pastoral, delivering pastoral care, tending to the well-being of those in their charge. And that absolutely is something that they are called to do. Alternatively, we might focus on the role of shepherd, mentoring and teaching the sheep. Here, the focus becomes on feeding the sheep with spiritual and ethical guidance, with biblical exposition and Christian instruction. In my youth, we talked about shepherding and heavy shepherding. I don't know if any of you have ever come across this. I see a few nods. The heavy shepherding was where the sheep lost agency, where the pastor was controlling, where mentoring and teaching felt coercive. It's always helpful to reflect on where exactly a good practice can tip into spiritual abuse. Those of you who are ordained or have attended ordinations may be familiar with the idea of being called or commissioned to feed sheep. In the Church of England, in the ordinal, we read some very challenging words. I'll go through them. I don't expect any of you to have memorized these if you've ever heard them before. First set is priests are called to be servants and shepherds among the people to whom they're sent. And also, they are to set the example of the good shepherd always before them as the pattern of their calling. And then there's this terrifying bit. Remember always with thanksgiving that the treasure now to be entrusted to you is Christ's own flock, bought by the shedding of his blood on the cross. It is to him that you will render account for your stewardship of his people. It seems very weighty when you're being ordained, I can tell you. John 21, with its threefold injunction to feed my lambs or tend the sheep, is just one of the biblical texts that underlies the important directions in the ordinal. You can probably think of others. The ones that came to mind for me were the parable of the lost sheep and the irresponsible shepherd in Luke 15 and Matthew 18. I always say the irresponsible shepherd because leaving a valuable flock of 199 or 99 to search for the one lost, useless sheep seems rather foolish, doesn't it? And there's John 10, where Jesus describes a shepherd followed by his sheep because they recognize his voice, and then goes on to say that he is both the sheep gate and the good shepherd. And of course, there's the 23rd Psalm, which we find strangely comforting, despite the fact that it seems to be about a shepherd leading a flock to a temple to be sacrificed. But it is still a classic text used so often, particularly at funerals. My favourite, though, is Ezekiel 34. So if you want some homework from this, it's to go away and have a good read of Ezekiel 34. In Ezekiel 34, feeding the sheep has a whole different angle. The prophet Ezekiel was pondering both why his community had been taken into exile in Babylon and how they could move forward. The answer to the first question in verses 2 to 5 was bad shepherding had led to this by the leaders of Israel. Thus says the Lord God, you shepherds of Israel who have been feeding yourselves, should not shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat, you clothe yourselves with wool, You slaughter the fatlings, but you do not feed the sheep. You have not strengthened the weak. You have not healed the sick. You have not bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strayed. You have not sought the lost, but with force and harshness you have ruled. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd, and scattered they became food for all the wild animals. And the solution, well, God decided that if a job's worth doing, God should do it God's self. Because the sheep had become prey, the shepherds had not searched out those that were lost, because the shepherds had fed themselves and not their sheep, God would rescue the sheep from their hand. So in verses 11 and 12 of Ezekiel 34, it says, "For thus says the Lord, I myself will search for my sheep and will seek them out, as shepherds seek out their flocks when they are among their scattered sheep. So I will seek out my sheep." And then verse 16, "I will seek the lost, and I will bring back the strayed, and I will bind up the injured, and I will strengthen the weak. But the fat and the strong I will destroy. I will feed them with justice." When I first read the words, "I will feed them with justice," I thought it meant I will feed my sheep justly. But when I look more closely at the text, I think it might be more along the lines of, "I will force feed the fat and the strong with judgment. I will ram justice down their throats." That's a whole different sort of sheep feeding for you. Here in this classic justice text, we can see what God's shepherding is really like. And here we see three clear challenges. The first is that good shepherding is not all about us, the shepherds, not about our entitlement, our comfort, or our status. "Ah, you shepherds of Israel, who've been feeding yourselves. Should not shepherds feed the sheep?" The focus should be firmly on the needs of the sheep. Secondly, feeding the sheep and following the example of the good shepherd is about focusing on the vulnerable sheep, seeking the lost, bringing back the strayed, healing the sick, binding up the injured, strengthening the weak. So almost back to that lost sheep parable, where you switch your focus as a good shepherd onto the one that's vulnerable. And then the third is that feeding the sheep is also about justice. And that does not end with providing a food bank or a debt advice service. It entails addressing injustices in our community and also injustices in our institutions, which must include the failure of our society and our church to safeguard the most vulnerable. So if we answer, "Yes, Lord, I know that I love you," as Peter did, then this is the sort of sheep feeding that those of us with church leadership responsibilities are called to. This is the sort of sheep feeding that Peter was being called to. I don't know how many of you read the final report of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, the ICSA report, the final one that's only recently come out. It focuses on sexual abuse, and of course there are other forms of abuse that we need to protect against: physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual. But just for a moment, I want to go to the statistics around sexual abuse in England and Wales, as outlined in the ICSA executive summary. You can find it online. If you Google ICSA, you can find all their reports. According to their report, there are nearly 13 million children in England and Wales, each of whom needs or deserves to be protected from harm. Babies, toddlers, and children are all potentially at risk. And the current estimate is that 1 in 6 girls and 1 in 20 boys experience child sexual abuse before the age of 16. So think of that enormous number, the number of children, and then it's 1 in 6 girls and 1 in 20 boys. In March 2020, the Office for National Statistics estimated that 3.1 million adults in England and Wales had experienced sexual abuse before the age of 16, 3.1 million. The work of the inquiry over 7 years demonstrated that child sexual abuse is not a problem consigned to the past. It argued that the explosion in online facilitated child sexual abuse underlines the extent to which the problem is endemic within England and Wales. It described not just a national crisis, but a global one. And it pointed out that the devastation and harm caused by sexual abuse cannot be overstated. The impact is so often lifelong, and it's such that everyone should do all they can to protect children. That would be good shepherding, protecting the vulnerable, in this case children, but adults too. So how have the church got on with that? Let me focus on the Anglicans, probably the best to point the finger at yourself, not at anyone else. The Anglican Church investigation by ICSA reported that a total of 390 people associated with the Church of England from the 1940s to 2018 were convicted of sexual offences against children. In 2018, 449 concerns were reported to the Church about recent child sexual abuse, of which more than half related to church officers. Latterly, a significant amount of offending involved downloading and possession of indecent images of children. ICSA made this rather damning observation. In the context of child sexual abuse, the Church's neglect of the physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being of children and young people in favour of protecting its reputation was in conflict with its mission of love and care for the innocent and the vulnerable. And I think that's a really insightful observation, that we have this mission that we're explicit about, that Jesus was explicit about from the very beginning of the church and before, from the time Christ walked on earth. And yet our own concerns with the institution have pulled us in the opposite direction almost. I think the other point it makes is that the Church of England has not responded consistently to victims and survivors with sympathy and compassion. It hasn't provided appropriate response or support, and that's often added to the trauma of those who've experienced child sexual abuse. That's come up again more recently in a report by the Independent Safeguarding Board, which has just been published, about what a pastoral response to survivors should look like and what survivors have to say about the current response of the church. And again, you can find that on the ISB website. I won't go on detailing reports. It's depressing, but I think you get the picture. The people we serve are the sheep of the pasture, the people whom God loves more than we can ever imagine, the people God wants to flourish and for whom Jesus came, that they might have life in all its fullness. If the answer is yes, Lord, you know that I love you, then you need to take seriously the injunction to feed the sheep, and to do so following the example of the Good Shepherd, seeking the lost and the lame, binding up the injured, protecting the most vulnerable. And where the neglectful and abusive shepherds have failed the sheep, then you need to work for justice for those who are victims or survivors. Do you love me? Asked Jesus. Well then, make sure you are good shepherds, feeding my lambs. So how do we do this? How are we to be better shepherds in the future than we've been in the past? Well, it's going to take intentionality at every level in our institution and in our mission and in our ministry. In terms of safeguarding, much of it starts with knowing what the policies and the guidance say and complying with them. It's dull stuff, isn't it? But it's necessary stuff. So being diligent in following safer recruitment guidelines, ensuring there are role descriptions for people, taking up references, getting a signed confidential declaration form, undertaking a DBS check when that's appropriate at the appropriate level. It's not that everybody is DBS checked. There are rules around who can be and should be and how. The other thing that's really important is providing volunteers and employees with oversight and support. That's a key thing in terms of safeguarding. Then there's the issue of compliance with training requirements. Are people trained to the right level for their roles? And are they renewing their training when required? And how do we know? And what about whistleblowing? Is it clear who people should go to when they have a safeguarding concern? And can they access support when they need it? And are we risk assessing our activities? We've got really good at risk assessing during COVID, but are we risk assessing our activities and ensuring they're conducted in the safest way possible? How many adult leaders do you need for the children's work, or the roving nativity, or whatever it's called? You know, how many people do you need? Should anyone be lone working with adults who are vulnerable? I would say no. What's the policy around giving people lifts home from an event? The list is endless, but we need to attend to it in each case. It takes an intentionality, a commitment. It feels like red tape, another hoop to jump through, but it's really, really important. Because loving Jesus and caring for the sheep is heart stuff, we also need to attend to that. So compliance is one thing, but feeding the sheep and the lambs is heart stuff. So it's not just about getting the paperwork right. Only really caring for the sheep will make us curious enough about the dangers they may be facing or the harm they experience. Only looking out for the one lost sheep will allow us to step away from the herd and to really see what's happening to them. Only a deep, heartfelt hunger for justice will motivate us to both change the way the church responds to survivors and victims, and to speak truth to power. So I think what I'm saying is there's all the compliance and the training and the paperwork and the recruitment and the risk assessment, but there's also this deep, heartfelt love for the sheep. That's what a good shepherd is. So there's the intentional stuff about complying, but there's also keeping this alive and not being so burnt out that you can't feel it. You need to feel it in safeguarding, because if you feel it, then you will ask the right questions, be open to hearing what people say. You'll be noticing things. You will be braver in speaking out, and that's so important. We also need to attend to the overall culture of our organisations. So in Chester Diocese, our curates have been reading, it's sitting on my desk. This is great back to front, you can reverse my screen. But it's called A Church Called Tove by Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer. It's quite an old book now, but it's a really useful book because it's about forming a goodness culture, a healthy culture, and one that does not foster abuse. And because the examples are a bit dated and they're in America mainly, it's actually quite helpful because you're sort of looking further away, which allows you to then look back without becoming defensive about your own organisation. And we've been going through this in the book group. And I think it's really helpful. And it's the point I want to end on, really. So we've talked about safeguarding and compliance. We've talked about the heart stuff. But I think this book is quite useful, as are some others, about how you build a healthy culture. And there's that phrase, isn't there, about culture eating something for breakfast, or I can never remember it, or something eating culture for breakfast. Liz is going to think of it now and tell me what it is in a minute.
Culture eating strategy for breakfast.
Culture eating strategy for breakfast?
Yeah.
So you can have fully compliance in, but if your organisational culture isn't healthy or right, then you still won't achieve a safer church or a safer organisation. So this is what Knight and Barringer have to say. They argue that we have to nurture certain habits of goodness if we are to be places where abuse is resisted and well-being and healing are promoted. And they set them out in a circle, which if I was going to do clever technology, I could have shared with you, but instead you can look it up in the book. But let me just tell you what they are, so you get the hang of what I'm talking about. We've been exploring with the curates how we do this in our churches, how we do this in the places we minister, our chaplaincies, how we do this in the places that we work. The first is to nurture empathy. That goes back to the heart stuff, but also to resist the narcissist culture. And there's a lot written about narcissism and leadership in the church. And I'm not going to be deviating into that now, but nurturing empathy, the first. The second is nurturing grace and resisting a fear culture, because it does not help if we are in a culture where people are afraid of making mistakes or owning mistakes or recognizing their own bad practice. We need to resist the fear culture. Putting people first is the third one. And that thing about people, not the institution, goes back to what I was saying earlier that ICSA had picked up about our, care for our institution. Means that we're not doing what we're called to do. We're not putting the people first. We're not really loving people and protecting the vulnerable because we're caring for the institution. You need to resist that institutional creep. Fourth one's tell the truth. Resist false narratives, confess, repent, and form a truth-telling culture. A place where people can be honest about themselves, and with each other. The fifth one is nurturing justice and resisting a loyalty culture where you will stand by the leaders even when there is injustice. Sixth is nurturing service. Resisting celebrity culture is part of that. We're not here to be celebrity leaders or to create the best cathedral or the best place of worship or the best community project. This is not about celebrity or status. It's about service. And the seventh was nurturing Christ-likeness, resisting the leader culture. If we really love Jesus, if we are to honestly be able to respond as Peter did, yes, Lord, you know that I love you, then we need to be part of a major culture change in churches and religious organisations. We need to move beyond compliance, though that is important. Attend not just to our own behaviour and heart space, but also look at how we all can be part of the wider change that we need. Do you love me? Says Jesus. Feed my lamb.
Thank you, Julie. I don't know whether anyone's got any questions about that. That was Jezza, yeah. You still mute. You still mute, Jezza.
Still mute, Jezza.
Oh.
Yay.
Oh, at last. Yes, you mentioned about when Peter was saying, the Lord said to Peter about the lambs and the sheep. Do the lambs represent children?
I don't think so. I think it's just one was feed my sheep. One, I think I got it wrong when I read it. One's tend my sheep and one's feed my lambs.
Wow.
I just think it's 3 different ways of basically setting out this shepherding model, isn't it? I think we could read a little bit too much into that. I think we know from Jesus' approach to children, which was unusual, that there is a sort of prioritizing of children that you wouldn't have expected within that particular culture. And we know that we've got a responsibility to care for the most vulnerable. That comes through repeatedly in the teaching, and children are clearly amongst the most vulnerable.
Thank you. And in Ezekiel, the chapter you read, it was verse 17. And in the James version, it says, I will feed them with judgment. Your version said justice.
Justice, yeah. There are different ways of translating the Hebrew, and I think sometimes it's translated as justly. As I said, I will feed them justly. Sometimes with judgment, which is closer to what I was saying. And you're right, the NRSV says justice, and I think in a way, maybe the King James got that a bit right in a way, because it feels like it is a judgment.
It's a strong word, isn't it? God's intervening. It says judgments on these bad shepherds. I mean, my passion in life is against this child abuse and the murder of our children, baby P, Logan and Arthur. It's just absolutely, it's endemic in our society. And I really loved your message, and I thought it was fantastic what you had to say about that. No, thank you.
Thank you. I've stunned everyone else into silence. Only Terry, apparently.
Thanks ever so much for that. And it really brings out that feeding sheep is just not a quick slapping food in the trough. You see some farmers who do it, and they're almost tending each animal as they go down that. And it's so important for us to remember that feeding is not just speaking out or just giving words, it's getting alongside. And the word nurture you used, I think that's really, really important.
Jane?
Thank you. It was interesting to contrast what was in the reading about Jesus helping Simon to get his flock, his fish, and then saying, right, you've done that, now come alongside and have some breakfast, and gave him bread. And another quotation that you used, where you said the focus should be on the sheep, not on the shepherd. But Jesus seems to be putting some focus on the shepherd. And I do think that's important. I've been both a teacher and a school governor. And I think one of the privileges of being a governor was supporting the teachers. And I was the safeguarding governor as well in a secondary school, and supporting the teachers in that situation as well, so they then can support the children. It was really interesting and really gave me a great deal actually from that responsibility, because I don't think we can just say we've just got to focus on separate out the flock and the shepherd and just focus on the flock and forget about the shepherd. You know, I think the shepherds are important as well. I'm sure you, in your job with ordinance, you obviously are going to focus on them themselves as well as the job that they're going to do.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think you have to think about who the flock is in each situation. So, for example, in a parish, you could argue that the parish priest and the lay ministers and the lay leaders, their flock is the congregation. But you could argue that part of the bishop's flock, for example, are those very people who are leading that particular flock. So then it would be the clergy, the lay minister. I think this runs through a whole organisation, or it should do, shouldn't it? In any context, use the teaching context, where there are people caring for the people who are caring for, and we're all sheep in someone's flock. But the responsibility of the shepherds, it is really important that they are mindful that this is about the sheep. Yeah. What you hope is that they're also being cared for in it. But yeah.
And just to add to what Terry said about the farmer feeding his animals, if you go into a food bank and you see the way they the volunteers in the food bank interact with the people who are coming along to get the food, they do so much more than just feeding those people. You know, they give them advice, and they often do school uniform and extend beyond just actually handing food to them. As Terry said, it's not just throwing food in the trough, which is a lovely picture, but there is so much more to it than just, I mean, I spend a lot of my time feeding people, but there's so much more to that.
And that is part of our safeguarding work. We've grown to think about safeguarding in terms of abuse reported, how we respond in terms of child protection, etc. And we sort of forget that we do a whole load of proactive stuff on the front line that is protecting and caring for vulnerable adults or for children and young people, and through things like food banks and clothing banks and all sorts of warm hubs and loneliness projects. And that actually is some of our real frontline work. It's so important.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much for giving such a stimulating talk. I'm sure everyone will go away and either talk with somebody else or look at their notes and think about it. It's fascinating. Thank you so much. And drawing out the detail of sheep and shepherd and what that means and how that fits into safeguarding. So important. Thank you. Thank you so much. Next week, it's Michael Layden, who is Principal of Emmanuel College. Do join us then. That's the last one of the series in the autumn. So do join us then. But thank you so much, Julie, and have a good week, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.